Late afternoon, early evening, everyone. Let me welcome you to SUNY Global. My name is Stan Litow, and I'm a trustee of the State University of New York and chair the Academic Affairs Committee for SUNY, but I also serve on the board of Education Trust New York. And I think that this is a great time to have you here and a great time to hear from the experts on the panel who are going to be able to give people a really good overview of where things stand right now in terms of the future of public education in the United States of America. People always talk during the campaign about existential threat. The threat is real. It's happening. And that in this period of time where the news gets even more difficult, I would like to say day by day, but minute by minute, right? What we really need is the authority and the facts of what's really happening. And we can't rely on social media, and we can't rely on the information that's out there. We really need people who are going to give us the facts of what's going on. And it's about what's happening to the U.S. Department of Education and funding and staffing, but actually it goes beyond that because things like deep Medicaid cuts affect our schools, and so many other things that are going on affect everything about education. I know a little bit about education. I served as Deputy Chancellor of Schools here in New York City back in the 1990s, and ran a foundation, the IBM Foundation, and did 3 national education summits back in the 90s for the president and the nation's governors. And what we all know is there's nothing more important than education. It affects absolutely everything in our lives. And getting through this situation is going to depend upon information and data and people that we could trust. And that's why I joined the Board of Education Trust, because trust is absolutely essential, and I'm delighted that we have so many experts on this panel to be able to take you through where we are. And thank you for coming to SUNY Global. And our future as a university is about what we do about the facts and what there's a lot of people when you talk to them, and I'm sure everyone sitting here knows people who say, I'm turning off the news, I don't want to listen to it anymore, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. But that's not right. We have to fight back. So thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to the experts.
We'll share. Thank you, Stan. Thanks everybody for coming out. My name is Evan Stone. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Educators for Excellence. We work in very close partnership with the Education Trust, both here in New York and nationally. And I'm also proud to be on the Education Trust New York Advisory Board as well. So I'm going to frame up a little bit about what we're going to do today. And I'm hoping that we can get into a real conversation together about this work, because we're going to go through some of the things that we're most worried about, some of the biggest threats from the changes at the federal government, what that means for New York State and New York City, and then what each of us can do about it. But we also want to hear from you when we get to the Q&A about things that you're hearing about, things that you're wondering about, things that you want our organizations to be more focused on. In a second, I'm going to let my esteemed panelists introduce themselves as well. But first, I just want to acknowledge that Denise could not be here today. She had a little injury, and so she had to remain in DC. So I'm going to do my best, Denise, and fill in on some of these component parts. And I think that we're going to have, is Augustus going to join in for? Yeah. We're going to have one other person from EdTrust National zoom in for a few of the areas, particularly around higher ed and early childhood, that EFRE does less work. But to frame it up, Stan did a great job. This moment is urgent. In 2016, I think we had an administration that came in that had big ideas and little ability to execute on them. And now we have a Trump administration that had a plan that was laid out. It was a talking point on all the campaigns, Project 2025. But actually, when you look at what is happening, it is a methodical execution of that plan. And in that plan, it said in 10 years, we will remove the Department of Education entirely. And the first step is to decimate the staff at the department. And last week, we saw a reduction of force of about 50%, laying off a number of critical functions in the Department of Ed. And you won't hear from E3 or EdTrust that everything was perfect at the federal department. There was lots of things that needed to be fixed and tweaked and improved. But this is not an effort to fix and tweak and improve. You expect with a new administration to see disruption. This is not disruption, this is destruction. And the federal administration plays a critical role in backstopping what states do, in funding critical programs that are supporting kids and families across the country, in doing research, in making sure that dollars are going to the communities that they're intended to. And so we're going to talk through all of those issues and what they look like now, but I want to double down on the urgency of this moment. We're also hoping that you don't leave here today being like, whoa, that was a lot. Thanks for telling me. I'm going to go back under my pillow. And sometimes I feel that too. We actually want you to leave here thinking about what are the things that we can do in New York City and in New York State to fortify the systems that we know are serving kids. And what are the things that we can do in New York City and New York State when we look around at our congressional delegation to say, how do we actually tell them that we're not okay with these shifts? So we have 7 Republicans in our congressional delegation in New York State. 3 of those are in swing districts. 1 of them wants to run for governor. I don't think we want somebody running for governor on the Republican ticket if they're not held accountable for the cuts that they're supporting to critical funding streams for kids across the state. So we're going to talk about some of those things. I'll get off my soapbox, and I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves. So first I'll turn it over to Arlen.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here this afternoon. This will be a little depressing, but we also are going to try to think about what we can do to get ahead and be proactive and not just be fully on the defense. So I'm Arlen Benjamin Gomez. I'm Executive Director of EdTrust New York, and really appreciate you all being here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria Elise Stivane. I have the honor of serving as the Executive Director of E4E New York. I know that we're here both with our intellect and our heart, and I want to take a moment just to acknowledge how tough it is these days, and the fact that we are here and in community, thinking and dissecting this moment, but also thinking proactively gives me hope. And so I'm grateful that you're all here.
That was so positive. It's good because that's not my style. I know. I could tell you know what's going to happen. I'm Emma Videra. I'm currently Deputy Chancellor for Operations and Finance at New York City Public Schools, which means I oversee exactly what you would think upon hearing that, including our budget, and also oversee our immigration work, which is also very relevant for this conversation. I have done various things before, but most relevant here is I also spent a decade in D.C. I was Chief of Staff for the U.S. Department of Education in the Obama administration, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Budget. I served on the Biden-Harris transition team, for the U.S. Department of Education, so got to help see what it looked like to dig out of that situation, which is extraordinarily different from this one. And prior to all that, I worked in the body actually responsible for writing laws and funding the government. I worked in the U.S. Senate for Senator Kennedy on the Education Committee.
So as you can see, we're just going to let Emma answer all of your questions because she's actually done all the things we're going to talk about. Yeah. And Augustus, why don't you quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, Evan. Hi, everyone. My name is Augustus Mays. I'm the Vice President of Partnerships and Engagement at EdTrust. So I oversee our federal and state advocacy and engagement work. And glad to be here with everyone today. I think as my fellow panelists have already said, this moment is critical in the sense that not only do we need to be on the defense in terms of protecting public education, but we also need to prepare our students, our educators, and our advocates, especially in the states, to uplift their voices about why public education is so important and how it's made a difference. And then more importantly, holding federal policymakers accountable in this moment to stand up for us and to stand up for equity. And so this conversation today is the first step in engaging with you all in this conversation and the work that we need to do moving forward. So thank you, Evan, for the introduction, and look forward to the conversation. And good to see you, Arlen.
Thanks for joining us. So I think we're going to try to put up a few slides, and we're going to start by digging into the potential impact on early childhood education. And I should say I have two quick caveats. The first caveat is we're just over 50 days in. You'd think like, oh, now we know what's going on, but things are changing by the day. So we'll try to give some like live updates to things as we know about them. But this was created 48 hours ago, so who knows if it is still right, just to be real. And the second caveat I would say is we want to paint the worst case scenario in some of these slides. And then we'll back down on sort of from there, what are things that we think are actually going to happen or might not happen or are 1 or 2 years or 3 years away from happening. But I think all of the things that we are going to say have been named as priorities for this administration. Whether or not they're going to be able to execute on them without Congress is a question, and we'll dig into that. But some of these are going to be like, wow, that scale of cut would be devastating. And that is because we do want to show you what the intended plan is, even if it's over multiple years to get there. So with that, I'm going to turn, I think, Augustus, do you want to talk a little bit about the potential threats at the federal level to early childhood, and then we'll turn over to Arlen to talk about at the local level.
Yes, thanks, Evan. So while much of the focus, from this administration in its first 50 plus days has been on K-12 and higher education, there are similar proposals and threats that early childhood education, childcare, and critical family supports face in this moment. The proposals that are on the table, most of it right now is through budget reconciliation, which I can get into. It's really in the weeds, but basically it's tax law and how can they leverage tax and revenue proposals to address the budget, but also to get to their sort of priorities. And so some of these proposals would make it even harder for families to access high quality, affordable childcare, early learning opportunities, and around the preparedness of children to be school ready when they hit kindergarten. As at the top, Stan had mentioned, we've already seen some proposals in Congress to cut Medicaid. So as I said, through the budget reconciliation process, there have been talks about finding savings to, extend the Trump tax cuts for billionaires and to do that on the backs of working families, middle class families, through cuts to Medicaid. And as we all know, Medicaid covers a number of our families and children in New York. Half of all births in New York are covered under Medicaid. So you're talking about a tremendous stress that's going to be put on mothers and babies and their health risks that would come with that without that federal funding. Also on the appropriate side or the appropriation side, we're also hearing about efforts to prevent the extension of the child care tax credit. And as you know, in 2017, that was temporarily increased from $1,000 per family to $2,000. So there's a need for that to extend it in 2026. So there's going to be conversations, right, around should we extend that tax credit, by how much, or should we cut it? We've been hearing from, and I'm sorry, I forgot to say at the top of the call, I'm based here in our DC office. So our federal advocacy team is engaged with the Hill and folks in the administration all the time. And we've been hearing from our congressional sources that, they're looking to potentially not extend the tax credit at the levels of the 2017 level or the $2,000 threshold. They might cut it even less. So that would be, again, devastating for our families and for our children. And then again, beyond the immediate threat. So what we're looking at, again, as I said, in 2025, through appropriations and through budget reconciliation, Project 2025 also proposes even deeper cuts to other early childhood programs. So as Evan said, there's immediate threats, and then there's this long-term plan that's in Project 2025. And we should believe them when they say they're going to enact that plan, because they already have. And so they're trying to, again, put up proposals as well to eliminate programs like Head Start. So we all know this would reduce childcare availability. It would drive up costs. It would provide disproportionate, harm to families and from low-income backgrounds. And again, now this action around eliminating Head Start takes an act of Congress. But there's a narrative piece to this, right? As the administration continues to talk about the federal role and its lack of importance and continuously trying to find ways to weaken it, they're hoping, honestly, by the 2026 midterms, that they will then have the momentum and the public will to gain majorities in both the House and Senate where they can do what they want with these types of actions. So it's really serious, again, for us to uplift right now for families, for students, for the education ecosystem, but particularly around childcare, what's at stake and why people need to speak up about why these programs matter. So that by 2026, when the midterms come along, we have already built our narrative and we have the support of the public, and they won't allow that to happen. So I'm gonna hand it over to Arlen, I believe, to talk about the state context.
Yes, great. If you could mind putting back the slide, that would be great. So to talk about what this means in New York, we know that expanding child tax credits is a proven policy to reduce poverty. When it was done under the American Rescue Plan, increased to $3,000 in 2021. It benefited 3.5 million students in New York, children in New York, and it lifted 250,000 out of poverty. So moving from a $2,000 to a $1,000 credit has the opposite effect and driving more students into poverty. When we think about Head Start, the impact in New York is that there's a potential loss of $77 million for Head Start families, and that could affect 50,000 children in New York. And while that is a long-term goal, we know, I was looking back, it's day 58. On week 2 of the Trump administration, there was the funding freeze frenzy that happened, and it had a direct impact in New York. There's a program we know, for example, in Buffalo that had to temporarily shut down, laid off 84 staff, 200 families didn't have access to childcare, and they're still struggling to get out of that financial hole. So it's not just theoretical, it's already having real world impacts here in New York. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we are fortunate is that we are a state that's operating with a budget surplus. And so there are opportunities with the governor, with the legislature to do some proactive advocacy on not only thinking about how to support these families in general, but how can we do that work in the context of these potential cuts at the state level. So the governor's budget and the one House bills that came out last week all include different versions of a tax credit for families. We're really supportive of the one House bills that came out that have the working families tax credit in negotiations now to figure out exactly what that looks like and what that means in New York, but in general are in a position to be able to increase tax credits for families here in New York. So that's some work that we're doing now. Moving forward, we need to really invest in childcare in New York. The governor has a proposal to create childcare centers, which is great, but if you don't have a workforce to staff them and you don't have families that can afford to be there, I don't know what we're doing. So we are doing some work to really start to lay the groundwork for next year to think about revenue raisers and what could we be doing to increase childcare subsidies. There's a fiscal crisis happening in New York City and other counties around the state where we had some great policy to increase the amounts for market rate, to better match the market rate and increase eligibility for families. But now cities and counties throughout New York are really struggling to figure out how do we pay for that. So that's some work that we need to lay the groundwork for and do in our next legislative session. And then I wanted to point out that the governor also has a baby benefit plan, which is a new thing that we're very supportive of. It's prenatal payments and postnatal payments. Post-birth payments, we definitely are looking to expand that and enhance it, but that is a proven strategy to help prevent families from falling into poverty. So we are in a decent place in New York, I think, to really invest in the early childhood space. We always want more money. We're always advocating for more, but I think there are some good proposals that we have going on in New York. And I would invite anybody else who wants to jump in on that.
One related thing, since Augustus brought up reconciliation, that I'm particularly worried about, because I think it's clear from the House proposed, the Republican proposed bill around reconciliation, that they also want to cut school meals. So they want to do that by raising the community eligibility percentage from 25% to 60% and require schools to get documentation of income verification for families and students. And they're saying that this would save $12 billion nationally over a 10-year timeline, which is $1.2 billion of meals for low-income kids across the country. So at a time that New York is also trying to move towards universal school meals, which we're really supportive of and would be huge, we're seeing the federal government potentially be undermining those efforts. So this is another example where I think New York can move and be loud about the need for the federal government to continue to fund this, because the evidence is so clear that for kids to learn, they need to have food in their bellies. So that's just one other area that I think we're watching closely. Emma?
As are we. So I want to add two quick things. And the first thing is just sort of a broader point that forgive me if everybody in this room knows this, but I have realized as we're starting to have these conversations that most people don't really understand what the U.S. Department of Education does, which is not really ideal at this moment in time. And we are going to talk more about that over the course of this presentation, but I actually want to use Head Start, which isn't even run by the U.S. Department of Education. It's run by Health and Human Services, but as the point that I want to make, which is the U.S. Department of Education and some parts of HHS are about equity in education. They do not, there is, worked there for 5 years. Outside of a very small number of unsubsidized student loans, there are not programs at the U.S. Department of Education that are not targeted for some particularly needy group. That might be low-income students, that might be English language learners, that might be students with disabilities, that might be students at HBCUs, Native American students. That's what the U.S. Department of Education does, and that is civil rights enforcement, right? We'll talk more about all this. But I say that to say Head Start is a good example for us in New York City in that we fund far more early education than Head Start here. We would like to do more. We are proud to do what we do. Head Start is about our lowest income kids. That is what that money is going to do. Even in a city that's trying to go beyond that critical foothold that ensures whatever else happens in our budget, which is complicated and large, the federal government is saying you need to focus on your lowest income families first when you think about who to serve in those programs. Ditto for childcare, of course. And I just think throughout this entire conversation, I really hope we can keep that in mind, because that foothold, which frankly, states have a mixed history of whether they ensure school districts and childcare programs and everybody focus on low-income kids. That's why we believe in a strong federal role, those of us who do, because states have not traditionally been great at this. We will talk more about this, I am sure, when we get to the K-12 section. But this is just another example of this level of focus and oversight, frankly, across the entire board, that I think is problematic and why we need to be thinking more aggressively about the state role from funding and oversight perspective. The second thing I will just say is, so we're clear, we in New York City get over $500 million from the federal government for our school breakfast and lunch program. We proudly already serve universal breakfast and lunch. We serve like 800,000 meals a day to our families. This is a huge deal. Like there's things that our budget's large, and part of this is like, who knows what we can figure out? But it is a very big deal that they are talking about this, and it's one of those things where they talk about just get the paperwork, it's all good. Anybody who's worked in any sort of system knows just get the paperwork when a bureaucracy says it might be all good, and from people with poor intent means we don't want you giving out that money to those families. And so some of these changes, and school food is just a great example, is one we are very nervous will get lost in the shuffle for exactly that reason as we move forward.
It's another one of those things that it's like, what, you just verify the income, no big deal. But that's a big deal. It's really hard to do, and it's something schools aren't doing currently. All right, so now we're going to go to probably the biggest funding stream for our K-12 system from the federal government, which is Title I. Augustus, do you want to jump in on this one, or is this, it's me?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. So Title I, as Evan said, I think it's around approximately $14 billion that's funded currently annually by Congress to support low wealth districts and directly to support low-income students from low-income backgrounds and students of color. And so, like the panelists just said earlier, Title I throughout its history has been that equity resource or funding stream that has been targeted to support districts to help provide that equity focus in terms of academic supports, transportation, food, nutrition, other things that districts and schools utilize this funding for. Now, currently, in terms of what's on the table before Congress and the actions the administration has taken, the administration would like to either, block grant or eliminate Title I. Given that Title I is authorized under the Elementary Secondary Education Act, it's, on the books under statute, it's probably not likely that it can be eliminated, obviously, by executive action, even though this administration has shown us that they would circumvent law and try to push executive authority as far and wide as they possibly can. But given what Secretary McMahon said during her hearing, that she would follow current law, current statute. So therefore, it's probable that that would not happen. But again, there are threats to Title I. Specifically, there are three ways in which we see there are threats to Title I. There could be direct cuts, there could be block granting that could happen, or there could be portability, right? Allowing those federal dollars to go towards other activities like private school choice. Now, we saw this playbook back in Trump 1.0, right? So taking you all the way back to 2016. Every year, President Trump and Secretary DeVos proposed in their annual budget requests one of these three things. They either try to cut Title I, and they did in their first budget or first couple budgets. They tried to cut Title I by 25%. They also tried to block grant Title I in one of their budget proposals to drain those resources that then would then allow for basically a universal voucher program for states to utilize to allow those federal resources to be used for vouchers or ESAs or other private school choice options. So we suspect, and later this spring, the president will introduce his FY26 budget request, because you remember over the weekend or on Friday, we finished with fiscal year 25, which is the current fiscal year that we're in from the federal funding calendar or that standpoint. So that appropriations process is closed, and now we're going to move to FY26. In FY26, we will likely see one of these three proposals. Thankfully, Republicans don't have a 60-vote filibuster majority. They hold 53 seats, so they would need 7 or 8 Democrats to cross the aisle to support any type of proposal like this. But that being said, I think we again have to be very cognizant of the fact of the narrative of this returning education to the states, which again, education, as we all know, in terms of funding, is only 10% of funding that states actually receive, districts actually receive in terms of federal support. But as we know, Title I and way our state and local funding systems are set up, for those Title I school districts, that 10% is greater than just 10%. In a lot of cases, that might be 20, 30% of their funding to support their students in their schools. So Project 2025, again, proposed changing Title I to a block grant program. So every year we can expect that they're going to propose these types of proposals for Congress to consider. And so it will be important, again, not to stand up the status quo that Title I has been working perfectly, but really shining the bright spots where Title I has made a difference. So where high-intensity tutoring around math or literacy has made a difference for low-income kids in these types of districts, we need to lift those stories up. Where Title I has made a difference in terms of transportation supports or school meal supports that have allowed students to come to school on time and ready to learn, showcasing those types of examples are going to be important. But in terms of Title I think it's those three types of proposals that we're going to see through the president's budget request. And it will be important for New York to stand up and sort of talk about how Title I has been effective and has been able to improve teaching and learning, and most importantly for the kids that it was intended for.
Thank you, Augustus. And then one other thing I will just say is, the difference between a federal formula-funded program and a block grant is that it has all these requirements and oversight. Another way to essentially have a block grant is fire all the people that do that oversight, so that the attorneys that make sure they are holding districts and states accountable, that the dollars go where it's supposed to go, are there to do those jobs. We saw a bunch of those attorneys lose their jobs last week. So I think most districts want to get those dollars to the right kids. I know Emma wants to get those dollars to the right kids. But I am sure there are districts and states across the country that are going to be very comfortable saying, I don't think anybody's going to be checking or watching where this money goes.
So in that context, we are currently in the midst of a major, I don't want to call it a battle, a negotiation around the foundation aid formula here in New York. Battle. It feels like a battle to me, I will say. So we had done a ton of advocacy to try to get a weight for students in temporary housing, try to increase the weight for students living in poverty. And unfortunately, the governor's proposal came back with a change to the formula that will actually drive down funding for students who are living in extreme poverty. And that will affect districts like New York City, other Big Five districts, Buffalo, Syracuse, Yonkers, Rochester, and almost 100 other districts that are labeled as high needs and low wealth. And so we are currently doing a ton of advocacy to try to figure out how do we fill that gap for those districts so that they don't get disproportionately harmed by that change to the formula. It's not the time to be driving down funding for students experiencing poverty. It's the time to be increasing funding for those populations of students. So we are in the battle. The one House budgets came out last week and tried to create some fixes for this. There are some good fixes in there to think about regional costs and driving more funding for New York City and Westchester in particular in the Senate version that we are supportive of. There's a new proposal in the Assembly bill to increase the weight for English language learners. We'll talk about a little bit more about that population of students in a second, but that would be a huge benefit for a place like New York City and many other districts throughout the state who have seen actually influxes and increases in those student populations. We've been doing, we are asking for a weighted funding for students experiencing poverty, so that's districts that have concentrations of poverty and have higher concentrations of poverty are receiving an increased weight for those populations. And then there's some other structural changes that we're trying to make to the formula to make it, we have not revisited the formula in over 17 years. We don't want this to be a one-time thing that we never go back and do again, so we would like to have a body that's is funded and established to be able to review the formula periodically, but in the context of these potential threats to Title I cuts, we just want to be really serious about it's time for New York to be investing in dedicated funds for students who are experiencing poverty. So I'll leave it there. Emma, I know this is your...
Okay. That's okay. I will say two quick things. The one thing is, first of all, I just want to double down on Evan's point about Title I. There's really 4 ways to eviscerate Title I, and one of which is to fire the lawyers. Which is what happened. Title I also includes things like the set aside for students in temporary housing, which is a dedicated funding stream that makes sure every district in America is doing something for students in temporary housing. That is a great example of something that is both a requirement of the funding stream that would presumably be eliminated in a total block grant, and actual funding for those kids, right? And so it's both money and oversight to ensure we are driving attention to a particular population, one that we have a very large and growing population here in New York City. And frankly, from both the federal side and the district side, I will say these requirements help hold us accountable for making sure certain dollars are going to them with certain requirements attached to that. And that's a teeny tiny example and one of like zillions one could share, but one that's very relevant to us now. So even when they say Title I, there's so many different pieces of that we don't necessarily think about. On Foundation Aid, Arlen said all the things I would have said, which is a way for me also to thank Arlen and EdTrust New York and Advocates for Children and those of you who have supported them, as well as Mike Rebell. It has been fantastic to see how strongly advocates have come out to support us at the state level. New York City has a lot of priorities at the state level, it turns out. I was disappointed to learn in this job, because this is obviously my priority. And the fact that there has been such a strong, active, data-driven community that is working on doing the real work to make the case to legislators has just been invaluable, and I think is why we actually made some progress in the One House bills. So huge thanks to you all and those of you in this room there. I think the other thing, no, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so this is an opportunity to get New York State to step up, to get a formula that really overemphasizes and weights low-income students more than it does already, that really drives more funding to English language learners. And I think we can use the threat of the federal government to help drive action on this and get legislators to be more aware of this potential risk. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the threats to immigrants.
Can I just say one thing about that? I will just say, I speak to state legislators a decent amount, city council members a decent amount. All they want to talk about is the federal stuff, which is great, but they are not doing their part at the state level, frankly, which would be a huge help. Like, I will put it, like, it is wild to me that we are looking at reducing funding for New York City at a time when we have these additional threats, at a time where we are home to many of the people those threats are to in a million different ways. And so just to say, like, I do think it's unfortunately a really good opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
So,
Yeah.
no. We're gonna, okay. Now we're gonna talk about the next set of cuts, which are focused on Title III, but we also wanna talk about other threats to the immigrant and multi-language learner community. The first thing is that You all have seen reports of this, that the president, through executive action, withdrew the sensitive location protection for schools. So we have not yet seen ICE go into schools, but we know that that is now something that is allowed and is not protected anymore. Hopefully we don't see that happen. I think there's only been one incidence of a parent being arrested right outside of a school so far in Chicago, but that's something we have our eyes closely on. That said, there is fear. Part of this is intended to create fear, and that fear is already reducing attendance for these populations, and we'll talk about what that looks like in New York City. The second thing is there is a very critical Supreme Court case, Plyler v. Doe, which requires all students, regardless of immigration status, to be served in our public schools. That case, there is a clear effort to bring that case back up in front of a much more conservative Supreme Court and question whether we have a requirement as a nation to serve all students or whether school districts should be allowed to check immigration status at the door. I am confident that in New York City we will continue to educate all students, but this would be devastating for immigrant communities across the country if we were saying, you can come here, or if you come here, we will not serve your kids. And that is the clear message that they want to send. And then the third thing is Title III, which is the federal funding formula to support English language learners across the country, which is also in Project 2025, one of the things that is aimed to be block granted or cut. Just like Title I, so that we don't repeat ourselves, it goes through those same processes. This is also a formula funded program that is in statute and will require 60 votes in the Senate. But that does not mean that they aren't going to undermine the oversight of Title III and allow some states and some districts to spend this money how they want. So we don't project immediate cuts to this, although it will be in the Republican budget. We will see them try to propose cuts to it, but I don't think we will see that happen, but we might see the oversight of this be undermined in a way that means districts and states across the country are just a little more flexible at how those dollars get used in their districts, and we won't have the oversight to ensure it's getting to the intended populations. Arlen and Madi, do you want to talk a little bit about the work locally?
Sure. So the ICE threats to schools is real. It caused the panic and fear that it was attended to. In New York, I will say as a parent of New York City public school students, in my school we are now organizing to get Ring cameras for parents to be able to know who's at their door, at their apartment door and who's knocking. So it's a real thing that's impacting our schools right now. We saw a dip in enrollment in New York City, which we can't say exactly why, because thankfully New York City does not collect information on immigration status, but we can speculate that that's due to fears that were happening in January around ICE raids in schools. The threat to Plyler v. Doe is very real. We can do some work in New York to think about how can we protect those students, while New York City is likely to not, maybe, I don't know, depending on who's mayor, likely to not say undocumented students can't attend schools. That's not the case in other parts of the state. So this is a real threat in New York. And then when it comes to Title III funding, we know, for example, New York received $68 million in dedicated Title III fundings. So that being said, I will say New York City Public Schools, Emma and her team have been doing an amazing job of getting information out there to school leaders, educators, guidance counselors, attendance staff, up and down the system, families, about what their rights are, what the rights of undocumented students are in our school system. We've also worked with the governor's team on getting guidance like that out there to school districts, and sharing some of the work that New York City is doing to encourage other districts to be doing that as well. SUNY leaders also are talking about this and thinking about how do we make sure that campuses are safe places for our immigrant students. We're also doing some work building a new statewide coalition for immigrant students. And it's an ad hoc coalition that we're pulling together, but we're going to start to do some advocacy. Some ideas I have are we should put in our law in New York that undocumented students can attend public schools. My legal brain says if we get 3/4 of the states to do it, we can get it into the Constitution, but that's a longer-term plan. Let's start with New York. There's also an issue with FAFSA, and we have a requirement in New York that in order to apply for state assistance, state tuition assistance, that you have to apply for FAFSA first, and so we're trying to decouple that and say if students from mixed status families are afraid to apply for FAFSA because they don't want to tell the federal government logically that they have an undocumented parent, that they should still be able to receive state tuition dollars. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about with the state coalition that we're currently helping to form. And then, as I talked about earlier, on foundation aid, we're really excited about the Assembly's version of the budget that has an increased weight from 50% additional funding for English language learners to 65% additional funding for those students. And we're currently lobbying the Senate to include that in the governor's office. So we're hopeful that we can get those additional dollars. That would example in New York City, Emma knows this best because she has her team do all of the analysis, drive $100 million, for example, to New York City for funding for those students. So it doesn't make up, receiving a Title III cut, but it's a good opportunity to think about how do we support additional funding for those students. So,
Great. I just want to quickly double down on two things. First, I just acknowledge the work that New York City Public Schools is doing under pretty interesting local political context, right? Where the chancellor, the deputy chancellors, Emma, all of you have to navigate this really interesting space between our current mayor and the current president of the United States. And so you're doing that by putting families first, and we're seeing that, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. The other is that listen, we are on the ground, and one of the very first things, if not the very first thing we heard through our organizers at E4E New York is that teachers wanted to know how they could show up for their immigrant students. What could they do? What did the changes really mean? What were the rights of their immigrant students? So we have been partnering with IM schools and have held a series of sessions and continue to do so to train K-12 educators on, the laws can be super confusing. So what can they actually do, and how can they show up for their students, and what are the rights of their students, and what does it mean for them? But I want to take a moment to acknowledge we have some of our organizers on the ground, and those very early conversations, getting on the phone with a teacher, going to a school, that was one of the very first things teachers said to us. What do I do in this moment? How do I show up in my classroom with my students? And so we need to keep that ground work strong and continue to make sure that the teachers are receiving the support and understanding and dissecting the changes that are happening from the federal level.
Emma, did you want to add? You're good? Okay. So we're going to talk for a minute about higher education, and I'm going to turn it back to Augustus to frame up sort of what the risks are at the federal level around higher ed, which are a lot. So Augustus, let's keep this as brief as we can so we can get to the questions.
Absolutely. So again, in the early weeks of this Trump administration, we saw a number of executive orders that focused on DEI and couching DEI as unlawful, right? And flipping Title VI of the Civil Rights Act on its head, and basically saying that any culturally responsive practices or infrastructure on the higher ed in terms of academic supports that are targeting students of color, low-income students, to support them, sort of expanding on the court ruling around banning affirmative action, but moving that towards other supports that support a diverse and inclusive and equitable environment on college campuses. And because of that, we've seen a chilling effect in terms of how universities across the country, particularly in your state, have had to navigate how they provide those various supports to students of color, first-generation students, parenting students, who need those additional basic student needs that institutions of higher ed have provided over the past few decades, and have really been able, not only around access and affordability to their institutions, but creating those environments that they can thrive. And so we've seen, again, those actions around DEI initiatives be challenged. Thankfully, there has been a litigation strategy where courts have stepped in and have halted any further actions or interpretations of, say, the Dear Colleague letter that came out in mid-February that sort of articulated what the department meant by that action that they took earlier in their administration. And then there have been states attorneys general, like your state attorney general, who has put out guidance around how institutions of higher ed should navigate, basically telling institutions that DEI practices are lawful. You should continue that work, and do not, fear, what the administration is pushing, because what they are pushing is unlawful. However, we've seen a lot of institutions pull back, already overcorrect in terms of the supports that they're providing in that space. And then I think the other piece around just dismantling the Department of Ed on the Office of Financial Aid, a lot of those staff who administer student loans, Other types of financial aid supports directly to institutions or students who receive those grants, like Pell Grants. We've already seen stories uplifted where some of that funding has been halted because of, basically there's no one there to administer those grants. The department said that was a glitch over the weekend, but I think we know what that means. And then we've also just seen already, other actions taken around restrictions around public student loan forgiveness, which targets nonprofit workers, which would disproportionately impact educators and other public servants. And then, of course, there has been also just efforts to the income reduction program, which then again makes student loans, financial aid in terms of payment or repayment less insurmountable for people to pay back, especially students of color, low income students. And so I think there's that at risk as well. And then lastly, I'll just say, and I'll hand it back over to you, Evan, a budget reconciliation, that process threatens a number of higher ed programs, SEOG, a lot of the student repayment programs, potentially also like Medicaid, as we said before, could potentially be cut. And again, reconciliation only requires a simple majority of both the House and Senate. So they don't need Democratic votes to move this through. And so we're monitoring, tracking that, engaging with Republican offices on the Hill to make sure that those vital programs that address access and affordability are maintained. But that's another threat that we're really, really concerned about.
Thanks, Odessa. So I'll make this quick just to think about some of the impact that this could have in New York. So there's threats to cuts to minority serving institutions, which I don't know, do you mind putting the slide back up so we can see? Which I just want to name that SUNY College at Old Westbury is one of those institutions, and half of the minority serving institutions are CUNYs in New York. So that's who would be impacted by this type of cut. We also, there's potential cuts to work service programs that allow students to be able to go to college and afford college. That's a big dollar amount, 117 million, and affect up to 44,000 students. So these are real high numbers. The student loan debt, giving Trump power over $6.7 billion in New York alone, and being able to drive that towards private collectors is a very scary thought. And so we have not historically done work on that issue in particular, but we're thinking about how do we do consumer protection work to make sure that we don't have private debt collectors now going after students to repay student loans. And then one other thing I want to name, just because we're at SUNY Global, is there is some work that's happening at the state. The SUNY ASAP and ACE are programs in particular that are really great for students and provide wraparound programs for students if they have food insecurity, housing insecurity, different things that we know are really important to make sure that they can persist and finish college. And so there is some money in the state budget to continue those programs, expand those programs. There's an opportunity at the state level to get some additional funding there. I will say that when I have talked to some of the higher ed folks at the state level of hey, you're gonna have to fill in the federal gap, they're like, we don't have enough money for that. So it's an ongoing conversation. We're trying to lay the groundwork to think about emergency relief funding and how do we make sure that if the federal government is messing around with people's loans, that there's a bucket of state aid that can kick in that circumstance. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Okay, next exciting topic we're going to jump into is actually my favorite one, which is accountability and assessment. So I think a few things to talk about here. The first thing is there was a proposal of 70% cuts to IES, the Institute of Educational Sciences. That was rolled back to be about 20% cut. But I saw the proposal. It was on the docket over the weekend, and it was only because a coalition of people started calling everybody we knew to say, do not cut. You cannot cut it this much. This would be devastating. And so what the biggest thing that IES does, well, not the biggest things, one of the things that IES does is the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is a really critical assessment that's given every 2 years. It is really our only bar that looks state to state to be able to compare student achievement across state lines. So this is in jeopardy. We know that this administration has no desire to see this program continued, although they will say otherwise, but we have had a number of opportunities to cut this. They could do this cut sort of unilaterally, and it would not require any votes in Congress. So we are very worried about the cuts to IES. They also do a ton of the research. that tries to determine what's working in schools across the country and uplift those things. There's probably a bunch of programs that IES has funded that could be removed. But again, this wasn't an example of them going in and saying, what are we doing research on that we really want to change? This was an across-the-board cut of 20% that was proposed at 70%. The second thing, and maybe the thing that I'm most worried about for New York State, hard to say that after the conversation we just had, but I do think that there's a real opportunity for states across the country to apply for waivers from this Department of Education, saying we want to waive the requirement. We want the federal government to say you no longer have to do annual assessment or accountability the way that you're doing it now. Under the law, states would need to propose some way to improve their current accountability and assessment plan, but improve is an interpretation of the current department. So what does that mean? It means a state that's had the biggest opt-out movement in the country could have the opportunity to say, actually, we don't want to require all districts to use the same assessment. We want to go back to the world to allow each of our districts to determine how they're measuring progress. We want to mask achievement gaps that we know exist in the state. And I think there would be a lot of political support in this state for that. And so I am very worried about the opportunity for states to get waivers on their current accountability and assessment system. And there has been a very clear open invitation from this federal department to say, send us your waivers, because one, we don't have the staff to do the oversight on your accountability and assessment systems anymore, and we don't want to have that role. We want states to have their own decisions around how they assess progress. Regardless of what anybody thinks about testing, the underpinning of all of the work we've done to try to improve our education system is driven by the knowledge of how kids are doing and in a comparative way. So if we want to know the impact of NYC Reads or NYC Solves across the state, we need these assessments in place to do that. I'd love to improve the assessments. They can definitely be improved. But without this federal requirement, we're at real risk of seeing them go away. I went out of my federal lane and started talking about the state one, so I'll just see Maria Elise. took some of the years you were going to talk about. What would you add to that?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, we need to keep NAEP, and we need to make sure that we make the case really clear at the state and level, because it's the only way that we're able to keep accountability. And so also there's the term, the honesty gap. NAEP gives us a real view of how our students are doing, and without it, compared to state assessments. And so without it, we will be missing critical information that we need now more than ever. And so we need to make the case and continue to make the case so that NAEP scores continue and that we have access to it, that data.
Two things. I can't overstate how important that fact. NAEP is the only check on how states assess kids. It is the way we knew when a previous Republican administration, that of George Bush, started thinking in the 2000s that states were lowering standards for kids once they had to include kids with disabilities in their assessments, once they had to make that information public. They believed states were starting to lower the standards of their tests, and the Bush administration started using NAEP and made clear states, in fact, were lowering standards on their tests, both achievement and content standards, right? And so it's the only way we check. And I would note, in New York State, where our state does wacky things with our assessment every single year, we desperately look for our NAEP results not because we love tests, every couple years to actually get an honest sense of what is happening in the city, what is happening in this city compared to other cities. It's like a remarkable check on the entire system we have. It is something that has been historically deeply bipartisan. Some of the loudest opponents of eliminating NAEP are Republicans, who are like, that's how we show when schools are good or not good. Like, we also want to show that, for all the wrong reasons maybe, but we also want to show that. And so I would say that, and then on the flip side, Evan, I would just say, it's not just about different tests. It's also, we might not have annual assessments each year, which has pros and cons, but means you can't look at student growth, which is one of the important ways to actually measure impact of New York City Reads or anything else. You can't really do that unless you're assessing the same set of kids annually in a meaningful way. Again, lots of thoughts about the tests themselves, but like anchoring our work in the impact of our programs means having annual results in that way, and then being able to focus on our highest need kids means the kids in the South Bronx need to be taking the same test as the kids in Scarsdale, or we actually have no idea how they're doing comparatively.
And then, Evan, I just want to say one thing just to amend what you said. NAEP is required by Congress. It's congressionally mandated. It's authorized under the Education Sciences Reform Act. So we in New York, you have the opportunity to, again, engage with your congressional delegation. And for all the things you just said, the reason why we want to be able to compare data across states, understanding the opportunity gaps that are happening across student populations, you can, again, hold your congressional delegation accountable, let them know, hey, this is an assessment that is very useful. It's important for school improvement in New York State. And you do your part, Congress, by ensuring that the Department of Ed continues to administer it. And the other thing around the RIFs is NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics that oversees NAEP, in those RIFs, they eliminated all but one staff member in that center or office that oversees NAEP, and that's the commissioner or who oversees that. There was at least almost 100 staff that oversaw that assessment, and they fired all of them. So they essentially, yes, eliminated NAEP by making sure that there wasn't staff to administer it. And they can argue to Congress, well, we can't administer the 2026 NAEP assessment because we don't have staff to do it. So therefore, that's why we need to have Congress engage and make sure that they advocate and assume their role by saying, oh no, this is congressionally mandated. We intend for you, department, to do your job. So we got to speak up for that.
Awesome. Thank you. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the threats to equity more broadly by looking at the cuts to the Office of Civil Rights and then go back to the executive orders. And we'll try to go through these a little bit more quickly. But I would just say I think this is another huge area of concern. The Office of Civil Rights has a really critical and fundamental role at the department to make sure states and districts are serving all kids. What we just saw last week is 7 of the 12 regional field offices for the Office of Civil Rights, including the one here in New York, were closed and all of the staff were let go. That means if you're a special ed parent in New York and you are worried that your student is not getting their rights and services, if you don't have the means to hire a private attorney, you no longer have access to the supports necessary to hold districts and states accountable to your kids' services. And that is just one example of what this looks like. So the Office of Civil Rights is also mandated by Congress, but if we don't have the staff there to execute on those responsibilities, we won't see that work happening. And there's already a massive backlog of thousands of cases that the current size before the cuts was having a hard time getting through. So with thousands of backlog cases, now we know that the support and staff and services to oversee civil rights is really in jeopardy.
Can we do the next slide?
Sure, we can talk about the next one. So Augustus talked a little bit about the executive orders that have already happened. One, to threaten organizations away from using diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. The Dear Colleague letter that tried to clarify that, but actually sort of confused it because it said a bunch of different things. And then mandates the termination of all quote-unquote discriminatory programs using diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is a huge effort, I think, by the federal government to just cause fear across the sector by hanging the threat of federal funds over schools and districts and higher ed and nonprofits and others, saying if you have programs that we deem to be quote-unquote reverse discrimination, I have a hard time even saying that, but if you have programs that are doing that, your funds are in jeopardy, and we will use the Office of Civil Rights, the office that we just said has been decimated, to use what's remaining of that to investigate these infractions, not all of the other things that we were intended to do. Again, all of these are being challenged in the courts right now. Some have been stayed. That said, the threat is real, and we are seeing people run away from this as fast as they can, and so we have an obligation, I think, to try to hold districts accountable to their commitments, higher ed accountable to their long-held commitments, and prevent them from sort of over-rotating or over-correcting based on what's already happening. But here's a little of the state and local context, if you want to add to that.
No, I think that's good in the interest of time.
Or the next slide, unless you want.
All right, the last thing that we wanted to talk a little bit about is Title II, because given all of the work that's happening in New York around transforming instruction in schools that I know many of you care a lot about, whether that's NYC Reads or NYC Solves, a major funding stream for supporting educator development is Title II. We saw under the auspices of these DEI cuts, the federal department decimate over 100 grants that fund states and districts around, you'll see the initials up here, TSL, Teacher and School Leader programs, teacher quality programs, and supporting effective educator development programs. Just yesterday, the courts mandated that they reinstate all 112 of those grants that they had cut. Again, this is sort of like the funding freeze that Arlen mentioned. Now it's about these are nonprofits or higher ed organizations that have laid off staff, that have moved to say, I don't have this money, now needing to reboot and get programs back up and running that they had in the past. So even if this money does actually come back, it is really disruptive to have these changes happen. And cuts to Title II would be really devastating for the work on NYC Reads and NYC Solves.
I'll jump in here a little bit. Just a couple of figures for your appreciation. 217,522 teachers in New York benefit from Title II funding. So cuts to Title II would limit their access to professional development. I was just in a school this morning where amazing teachers were having a meeting with folks from New York City Public Schools and specifically asked, we want and need more professional development to ensure that we can deliver on NYC Reads, and the same would go for NYC Solves. So much so, our organization, E4E New York, has been gathering the feedback of educators on both of those large literacy shifts, and educators are saying the PL, the professional learning support, helps us show up in this moment and show up for our students. And so their ask today was around supporting the students and meeting the students where they are, but also we need additional support and additional professional learning. And so we need to keep our eyes on Title II and get that money, again, the largest shifts that we've seen in curricula in New York, and we need it to stay the course with it.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to questions because that was like a really depressing rung there right at the end. So I'm hoping somebody comes with these really uplifting questions. As we jump into the questions, though, you do all have a note card on your seats. And the reason we put that there is because what we wanted to also highlight is all of these organizations have had to double down on the work that we're doing, both to put more pressure on the federal level, and in partnership, EdTrust and E4E and a few other organizations have formed a national coalition called Protect and Improve Public Education. It's now 72 organizations across the country meeting every 2 weeks to stay on top of what's happening, coordinate actions, coordinate responses. We had a great press conference with Governor Hochul and former Secretary King, now Chancellor King, teachers, parents, and others to respond to the layoffs from last week. We are generating talking points to get out into states so that they can actually understand the impact in their districts and states. And at the local level, all of our organizations have had to double down. So that's my way to say on your card is information about how you can continue to deepen your support if you already support our organizations, and if you don't, to consider supporting them, because this work right now is foundational to what we've been trying to do for a long time. That's my first pitch before I go to questions, and then I'm going to do that one more time at the end. So if you're still thinking about it, I'm going to come back to you. Questions? Yeah.
So I had seen something, I don't know if anybody has heard anything more about someone named Penny Schwinn, who
Yes.
apparently was nominated as potentially deputy secretary. Is that still happening? And the reason I thought this might be maybe optimistic is because it seems that she is a real advocate for literacy and also for research in education. And it just didn't seem to line up with who was nominated for the Secretary of Education and anything else that this administration stands for. Do we know anything about her? And is that still in play?
Yes, I know Penny pretty well. She was the state chief in Tennessee. She has been an advocate for a lot of the things that I think we've talked about around literacy. She has been an advocate historically for funding for low-income communities. She was one of the people that I think a lot of people were calling when the cuts to NAEP were happening, because she's obviously in those conversations. She has not yet been confirmed, so she's not technically in her job yet. I do expect her to be confirmed within the next 3 to 4 weeks once the Senate gets around to confirming her, and she will be one of the assistant secretaries of education. At the same time, I don't think that she has any real power and influence in this department. I hope that she will be an ally in that seat. And I know she has a lot of relationships across the sort of educational equity community. But I'm not confident that she's going to be our sort of white knight within the department. And I will
Why would they even tap her? Like she's
Well, I think that they do want people that know how the system works. And so they did also bring in the state chief from South Dakota, who's another very competent leader who's done a lot of innovative work. Maybe some things we agree with, some things that we don't. But I do think they want people that understand how the system works to help them think about how they can unwind pieces of this. I will just say there were similar people that came in Trump 1 that left within the first year. And so I think she's a great leader, and I hope that she helps deliver on some of this or slow some of this down, but I also don't have a ton of confidence that she has the positional power to do that. Yes, and we'll come to you, Stan. Oh, right over here first.
Oh, sorry. Ladies first.
Hi, Emma. I didn't recognize you before. So we all have various networks, and while this is great, how can we develop talking points that we can distribute to other nonprofits and parents and the various Get Out the Vote organizations that we're in contact with, and how can we do it soon? Number one. Number two, we can't neglect the rural districts in New York because they voted for Trump. So where we can have talking points that can be distributed in rural districts, I think that would be essential.
I will just say that I think rural districts would be decimated by a lot of these cuts, and we have that data really clearly. There's a specific funding stream for rural communities from the federal government as well, and I will just say, so we are developing in partnership with EdTrust. On every 2 weeks, we're sending out a set of updates of what is happening and clear talking points. And we have a communication circle, so I'm happy to add people to that listserv to make sure the talking points are getting out. So one way from this is to make sure that we're using this list. We can share, for anybody that's interested, regular bi-weekly updates on what is happening, and also weekly talking points on how we are talking about these issues across the lines. The national coalition that I talked about, we have now about 100 organizations involved, 35 states. Most of those states are red states, and we're trying to be very thoughtful about how we get these messages out. And there are 3 very key congressional districts in New York State, 2 in Long Island, 1 in Westchester, that are maybe the Long Island ones are maybe +3 Republican. The Westchester district, or Westchester into the Hudson Valley, is maybe even a blue district by a point or two, where Congressman Lawler is. He wants to run for governor. People need to be in that district being really loud about these impacts, because he's in a critical position that could actually slow a lot of this down. They only have a 3-seat majority in the House right now until they get these special elections done. So there really is an opportunity to stop some of these cuts in reconciliation, where they don't need 60 votes in the Senate, if we can really put pressure on soft Republican districts. And I said that with my C3 hat on.
And to distinguish, I will not speak about the politics of your question. I will speak about the substance. I just want to say 2 things on substance. I care the most about New York City because we're the best and we have the best kids. And the state shouldn't be taking our money this year. But what I will say is a lot of these things in 2 critical ways are far more fundamental for rural districts. They are far more dependent on federal funding, quite dramatically. We have a tax base, we use it, that is far more substantial. The other, and unfortunately they don't have the advocacy community we have, and they are critical for this. The other thing that has occurred to me a lot over the course of this is, the cruelty is the thing, but also the chaos is the thing. I cannot tell you on immigration, race, transgender issues how much time we are spending helping our educators understand they do not need to change what they are doing. And these guys hinted at it and it played out publicly on the immigration front. But the amount of time we are doing explaining to our teachers that you can still teach our Black Studies curriculum. In fact, we're incredibly proud of it and we're not stopping it. That transgender kids still have all the rights they had and they are protected under city, state, and we believe federal law. That our immigration policies have not changed. But we're a huge, really high capacity district with good lawyers who are ready to go fight that out if we need to. The voluntary compliance we are seeing across the country and across the state by people who are not being told that in clear ways, who don't have don't have the people we have to help make the case, I just think is really scary and a critical place for the advocacy community to be able to not just on the political front, but on the actual, what can teachers still be comfortable doing? And also just really makes the case for our state to be super clear in communications and standing by and strengthening on the immigration front those laws. The AG has been great on all of this stuff, but it's the legislature and the governor who need to be hearing from folks too.
Stan.
Yeah, I have a question to follow up on this messaging and marketing and getting the word out. I don't want to talk about politics either, but during the
Political campaign, I spent 9 weekends going door to door in black neighborhoods in Philly, and the people who opened the doors didn't know a thing about what was going to happen to education. They didn't know a thing about it. They understood about, you know, the price of groceries and a little bit about immigration, maybe not in the right way, but they didn't understand this at all. And I think the communication, it's not just the talking points, it's thinking about influencers who are not our traditional influencers. I mean, this is something that's going to devastate the business community. This is something, when you think about it over time, it's going to devastate the economy. You know, we already have declining birth rates. And if you look at the data and all the information, and thank you so much, this was a great presentation, but I think we need a broader kind of marketing effort so that people really understand how devastating this is going to be. And I don't know if we can get help from really people with real knowledge in the digital marketing space, or to be able to get a group of influencers that are not on our radar, to be able to get these words out and focus in on those, as you mentioned it, those Republican areas and swing districts that might have an influence. I don't know that there's an answer to it, because it's going to require a lot of resources to be able to do what I'm suggesting, but I think it's critically important.
So it's almost like you're in our weekly comms huddles. This is what we're trying to pull off. So we do have a massive digital ad campaign that we'll be running. We've brought on several different political consulting firms that are mainly on the communications front. We are working with a series of micro influencers to try to get short social media stories built and out there. Jen Bluestein at Athena Strategies is helping to steward a lot of this that we've brought back in. She has both a history in education and in philanthropy and in political communications for a long time. So we are trying to build that out, but you're right, it requires resources. So this is my second opportunity to say, if you aren't supporting these organizations or you have the opportunity to double down, I think this is a moment for philanthropy to really stand up. We are asking organizations to stand up. We're asking teachers to stand up. And so I do think there is a moment in time for philanthropy to say, maybe this is the year we go beyond our 5%, those endowments, those stock market that has been raging over the last couple of years. I know the last month has been bad, but ignore that. I think this is a moment to think about, how do we in the philanthropic sector double down, or maybe push ourselves a little bit out of our comfort zone to say, yes, we've been supporting direct services. Is this an opportunity to look at policy, advocacy, or communications in a new light, given the massive threats to the investments we've been making and honestly the progress we've been making as a sector overall? Oh, one more question. Yes, Kirsten.
Sort of off to the side, but the threats to healthcare for our communities are also huge. Just wondering what the strategy is thinking.
So that we're not having a sort of, game of survivor against folks who are, as the pie gets smaller and our families need all of our collective support, is there some sort of work that's being done across other human-serving sectors so that we end up sort of winning on behalf of families and not fighting against one another?
I mean, I don't know that there's enough coordination across sectors. I do think healthcare is an interesting one because Medicaid is such a massive program in schools too, and so there's a lot of conversation on Medicaid in particular. My strategy is blow up the reconciliation process. Don't let it happen. Make it as messy as possible, because that's the first place that they can cut all these programs. And I actually think there's an opportunity to stop reconciliation from going through if we're able to be loud enough on all of these issues. And you can get 5, 6, 7 House Republican districts to say, this is too messy for me. There's too many things in here that my community is going to be upset about. And that would prevent the cuts everywhere. I think then there's the next budget, which is, I think, a place where you could have some of this zero-sum experience overall. But I just think the more we tell the story of these cuts would be devastating to individuals in communities across the country, rural communities, urban communities, red states, blue states, and actually tell those stories, we can slow some of this down in a meaningful way. And hopefully that's just like stopping it overall from happening, because they don't need to do a reconciliation process. Like, it doesn't need to happen for the government to function.
Can I just add two quick things? And this is not at all for my current job. I actually always say in my current job, I am dramatically concerned about the Medicaid cuts for our schools, for our communities, the SNAP cuts. Like, those are a huge deal. And what I will say is the way the congressional process works is that Medicaid and mandatory programs over here and are not actually a trade-off with discretionary programs over here. That's not true of everything, and I will circle back on that. But just from a very reality-based thing, there's not this one big pie that's shrinking. That's in part because Medicaid, the mandatory healthcare programs are just so huge. It's in part because they just run through a totally different process. And so there actually isn't a trade-off between Medicaid and this. And I would even go further and say, you know, even on the discretionary side, which is where the other healthcare programs that, by the way, student loans and Pell Grants are over here too. Even over here, it really comes down a lot to where the congressional appropriators set their own little mini targets. That is a very hard thing for anyone like us to influence. And so, and the last thing I will say, which is something a colleague who's deeply involved in these conversations, but I won't name her, said to me years ago was, like, why do we education people want to fix everything? Do we think when the healthcare people get together, they want to fix education? Are they advocating for our stuff? And I say that partly as a joke, but I will say there's conversations like this happening in this city and across the country on all the issues. And I think what's important is whatever is important to you, make sure you are in those rooms, because there's a whole nother room that Evan and I are not in that's advocating on those issues, and congressional appropriators are going to need to make these decisions, and we need the loudest voices on all of them, and not to be making those trade-offs ourselves. They created this situation. It's not a real situation. And like, we all need to be advocating as loud as we can for what we care about.
And in New York too. I guess my mind of asking the question.
Yeah.
Really in New York fact, so.
Yeah.
Yes, you should talk state. I can talk city if you want per se.
Well, I was going to say, I know in the early childhood space, we do a lot of really great work of thinking about across multiple different agencies and how are we making sure that our youngest New Yorkers are receiving the care that they need, not just in the education system, but across the board. I don't think we do a good enough job of that in the K through 12 space or in the higher education space. So I do think that there's opportunities to learn from how we do that in the early childhood space and do a little bit more of that collaborative work in the K through 12 space. Like, how are we thinking about healthcare systems that are affecting students K through 12 in school, and making sure that our budget has complementary, we're advocating for literacy. What are we thinking about community schools or services for students outside of school, and doing that collaboration. So I think there's work for us to do to improve on that.
And I would say at the city level, a version of what I just said, which is, we are having those conversations. I do think it's things like SNAP and Medicaid in the social service sector that are most dramatic so far. There's also things like emergency management, which apparently is not a thing anymore. Right, so there's other things outside of us as well. Those conversations are happening on the inside, but I'd say a version of the same, which is all of those communities need to be loud. It's going to be up to city council and OMB to make those decisions, and our job is to stand for the things we each believe in.
Okay. Hopefully this was informative and not too depressing, but also shows you there are things that are happening in New York that can fortify what we believe is really important and protect the most vulnerable populations of students that we know are most at risk. I'm just grateful that you all came out to learn about this, because that means you care about it and you're interested in it. All of us are available to follow up if you have additional questions, and we're just really grateful for your partnership and support.